My new book, by the way, is called Faith versus Fact. And if it's not in the lobby, it's, as Hitch used to say, it's available in fine bookstores everywhere. So, I want to do something, or start with a trope that was mentioned by Lawrence and Richard last night in their conversation when they talked about how wresting the blanket of faith from people often makes them very angry or distressed because their safety blanket, their Linus-like blanket of security has been taken away from them, and it disturbs them in a way that refuting their politics or their sports affiliation doesn't do. None of us, or probably most of us, don't need a blanket of faith, but what I want to do today is try to wrest away from you another blanket of faith that you sort of have, but one that's not based on divinity. And that is to challenge, and that's what I'm going to try to do in this lecture, challenge one of your most deepest held assumptions. An assumption that's so deeply interwoven with your psyche that it's part of your identity. And that is the view that you are conscious agents who can make decisions. That is, that you have free will. When you go into a restaurant, you can freely choose the chicken and the steak, that you can make any decision that is not constrained by the laws of physics. Now, many of you probably don't accept that. You don't believe that your robot's made out of meat, which is what I'm going to try to convince you of today. But I just want you to think about it, okay? This view is so instilled in people because we have this either genetically inborn or culturally acquired view that we're autonomous agents, that it's hard to think otherwise. But the laws of physics mandate that it is otherwise, and so I'll try to convince you of that. And at the end, the reason I'm doing this is, first of all, to try to show you that science actually tells you something different about yourself from what you feel deeply. But second of all, because there are certain salutary consequences of rejecting the notion of free will for both personal and social reasons that I'll talk about at the end of this talk. Samuel Johnson was one of the first people to argue against free will, but a lot of famous people, including Einstein at the end, also rejected free will, and I'll talk about that later. What I'll do in this talk is first mention what do I mean by free will, because the definition when you make an argument like this is crucial. Second of all, I want to prove to you or show you the evidence that belief in the kind of free will I'm going to talk about is pervasive throughout the world. Then I'll go to the scientific argument that our behavior is absolutely determined by the laws of physics. I'll go over some misconceptions about determinism. And then I'll talk about this nefarious movement called compatibilism, which is a view that even though science dispels the common conception of free will, philosophers have rushed into the breach and said, well, yeah, okay, we know that's wrong, but we have another kind of free will, and let me tell you about that. And then I'll tell you what's wrong with compatibilism and why it resembles in many ways theology, especially of the sophisticated sort. And finally, the important part, the sort of punchline, what the implications are for believing in determinism and rejecting free will for both your own personal behavior and for society in general. So it behooves me to start, first of all, with what do I mean by free will? And it's pretty much what everybody in their gut feels is free will. I use the definition by the biochemist Anthony Cashmore here in Proceedings of the National Academy. Free will is defined as a belief that there is a component to biological behavior that is something more than the unavoidable consequences of the genetic and environmental history of the individual and the possible stochastic laws of nature. That is, there is something you can do that violates naturalism and the laws of physics. And what he means is making decisions. So what you're free of in this conception of free will is you're free from naturalism. You're free from the laws of physics, both deterministic and purely indeterministic. And that's what people think of as free will, that they can sort of obviate these laws of nature. There's an alternative definition, which I'm going to reject just on physics grounds, but this is another common conception of the view. If you could replay the tape of life and put yourself in a situation in which every molecule in the universe was aligned exactly as it was before, and you had a decision to make, you would make exactly the same decision over and over and over again, because it's dependent on the molecules that make you up. Now, the reason I don't like this definition as much as the other one is because there is a fundamental indeterminism in physics that is the quantum indeterminism, as Lawrence was talking about last night. So it is possible that if human behavior is based on sort of the indeterminate movement of molecules of electrons in your brain, and we don't know that it is, that maybe if you're put in the same situation again, you would make a different decision, because then electron would have jumped the wrong way. Now that does not mean that you have free will, because your consciousness does not enable you to move the electrons in your brain according to quantum mechanics. But so you could think of this as an alternative definition of free will if quantum indeterminacy does not play a role in your decision. That is, you would always do the same thing if everything in the universe was configured in the same way. Let me briefly give you a taxonomy of free will, because there's two versions of it, the sort of religious, spiritual, and a very common definition, the dualistic version, which is that free will is independent of determinism or the laws of physics. That is, maybe most stuff, like balls rolling down inclines or space shots, are indeed obey the laws of physics, but there's one thing that doesn't, and that's your decisions, the way you choose to behave. And this is dualism, the classic dualism of religion, that is, that there's the ghost in the machine, that the mind and the brain are separate from one another, and the mind can actually control what the brain does. This, of course, is the classical notion of free will. It's called libertarian or contra-causal because it goes against the causes of the laws of physics. There's a star by it because it's the most common conception of free will that people really have when surveyed. Second of all, and we have the view, which is the scientifically true one, that determinism, and I'll include in determinism quantum indeterminacy, so I'll lump them both together as determinism. You could call it naturalism, that our behaviors and choices are completely governed by the laws of physics. That's all, because we are made of molecules, and molecules obey the laws of physics. And there's maybe some quantum indeterminacy there, but nobody's ever yet shown that the quantum indeterminacy has an effect on human behavior. Now, once you accept determinism, and the vast majority of philosophers do, although religionists don't, then you can divide yourself into another two classes, the incompatibilist class, which means that if you accept determinism of your behavior, that you have no choice, that what you chose for breakfast today was determined probably yesterday, it wasn't something you consciously decided to have, then you don't have free will, at least not in the sense that I mentioned before. But there's this other school of people who are also determinists, people like Dan Dennett, Eddie Namias. The vast majority of philosophers say that free will, there's another kind of free will. It's not contra-causal free will. We're going to redefine free will in another way that makes it compatible with determinism. And I'll talk about the various forms of compatibilistic free will, which I regard as semantic tricks, basically, to try to convince people that, we're still okay, even though we are meat robots. Okay. I'm an incompatibilist. That doesn't mean I don't feel like I have a choice when I go to the breakfast buffet, okay? This feeling of agency is so strong, I believe it was probably instilled in our genes by natural selection, that we cannot overcome it. But once we recognize it, then there are certain things we can do to improve society. Okay, well, libertarian or dualistic free will is the mainstay of many religions, and if you're a religionist or know anything about religion, you know that it's true. For example, one of the explanations that Christians apologists give for the fact that humans do morally horrible things to each other, despite the fact that God is benevolent, it shouldn't happen, is that God gave us free will. And that's more important than all this bad stuff that happens because of free will. So we have this sort of explanation for human evils based on free will absolutely predicates that we have a choice about whether to behave good or ill. It's also, sorry, that's the second point. The first point, of course, is that you have a choice about whether to accept your Savior. If you're a Christian, whether or not Jesus Christ is your personal Lord and Savior. And if you make that choice, you go to heaven. If you don't, you go to hell, no matter how good you've been. That, again, presupposes that you can make a choice, free choice between Jesus and not Jesus. And finally, of course, there's these other invidious effects of free will. Their view that homosexuality is a choice rather than something that's biologically compelled. Most of us probably accept the latter thing because the evidence is coming in on that front. But the view that homosexuality is a behavior that you can exercise by choice or not do it by choice is at the bottom of the view of Christians' condemnation of homosexuality. Okay. So libertarian free will, as I say, is a mainstay of not only Christianity, but also many religions. If religions promulgate a moral code, it presupposes that you have the choice whether or not to obey that moral code. Okay, now what's the evidence that most people believe in this kind of libertarian free will? And this was a survey that was done by Sarkeesian in 2010. He gave students in 4 countries a choice of thinking about 2 different kinds of universes. You don't really have to read this, but in universe A, it's a deterministic universe. Everything you do has been decided beforehand by your genes, the environmental influences that impinge upon you. And this has been, if there were no quantum indeterminacy, you could say your choice at breakfast this morning was determined at the Big Bang. But that's probably not true because quantum effects intervened in between. But if there were not, then yeah, everything was the result of the Big Bang. So if you decide to have French fries at lunch, like John does, then everything in the universe worked up to that very moment that John decided French fries, and he could not have done otherwise than choose those French fries. Okay, that is pure determinism, or naturalism, as I call it. Okay, and then he presents an alternative universe to the students in which everything still ticks along in a deterministic way, but you have a choice. There's one thing that's free from determinism, free will, and you have your choice about what to do. So Mary, I think this is an example of sexism because Mary doesn't like French fries, she likes a salad. Anyway, Mary goes to lunch, and in this universe, she doesn't have to choose the French fries. She actually has a free choice about whether to choose the French fries or the salad. Even if the circumstances were exactly the same, leading right up to that moment of choice, she could have chosen either one. Then they ask the students, okay, what universe do we live in? What kind of universe do you think we have? Is it the deterministic one, or is it the free will one? And the proportion of people that answer that we live in the free will universe, the universe where Mary could choose a salad instead of French fries, in 4 countries, the survey it's anywhere between 65 and 85%. Okay, so for people that say, well, nobody really believes that you can make a free choice, that's for people who are scientists and really recognize that fact. But for the average person, and even many scientists whom I encounter day to day, accept the fact that, yes, we live in a universe where our decisions, if nothing else, are things that we can really choose between. Then they ask, in universe A, which is the purely deterministic one, where people have no choice about what they do, are people morally responsible for their actions? Maybe you could raise your hand if you think they are. Nobody thinks they are? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Well, that's interesting because you're going against the grain of much contemporary philosophical thought. At any rate, most people agree with those who didn't raise their hands. That 63 to 75% said that there is no, the number of people that think that we have no moral responsibility in a deterministic universe is very high. Okay, so almost all of you here don't believe in moral responsibility. I can see that because you didn't raise your hands. Think about that. Most people think that in a deterministic universe, and this is the universe we live in, people are not morally responsible for their actions. The reason being, of course, because they can't make a choice about how they behave. And this is my view. And people always ask me this. What do you mean you're not morally responsible for actions? How could you not be? And my answer is, well, we're responsible for our actions because if I do something like steal, it is the entity known as Jerry Coyne that does the stealing. It is the entity known as Jerry Coyne that has to be punished or treated with disapprobation because of that. So in that sense, you're responsible. But I don't consider myself morally responsible because I don't have a choice. The very concept, at least to me, of being morally responsible for doing something means that you could choose to be moral or immoral. Okay, again, this is my view. I don't expect you to accept it. I'm just trying to get you to think about it because it's really a very interesting problem. Okay, why do I believe that the universe is deterministic? If you're a physicist or a naturalist, you have to, right from the very outset. First principles. We're made of molecules. Molecules obey the laws of physics. Therefore, everything in us, including the brains that make our decisions, have to obey the laws of physics. And the laws of physics are by and large deterministic, except with maybe a little quantum indeterminism thrown in. But neither of those means that you can affect the workings of your brain by somehow thinking about it. So even by first principles alone, this should settle the argument about whether what we do is determined, at least to me. But then there are experiments showing that when we think we've made a choice, that choice is actually made in your brain well before you think you've made it, and is predictable. And I'll give you an example of one of those experiments. And finally, there's a book, I can't remember who wrote it, called The Illusion of Free Will, in which a psychologist, I think at Harvard, shows that you can manipulate people's idea of agency very easily through psychological experiments. Ouija boards are one where people think that they don't have any agency about how they move the thing around, but sure enough, it spells out a sentence like, you're going to die next year or something like that. Clearly, you don't think you have agency, but you do. There's brain stimulation experiments where you put an electrode in a guy's brain in the emergency room, not in the emergency room, in the lab. He's conscious, and then you stimulate it, and the guy goes like this, which is an automatic result of stimulating their brain by electricity. And then you ask the guy, why did you wave your hand? And the guy will say, I was trying to say hi to that nurse over there. It's confabulation. He makes up a reason. He cannot conceive of what he did except as a result of a conscious decision he made. So the feeling of agency has been bypassed there by stimulating the brain. Okay. But really the first point here, the first principles of physics should be dispositive in this case. We're nothing other, as Anthony Cashmore said, we have no more free will than a bowl of sugar. And I firmly believe that, because we are bowls of sugar, just very complicated ones. And we have nucleotides and proteins as well. Okay, but if you don't believe that, I'll give you an example of one of the experiments that was done a couple of years ago by Soon et al. It's a little bit complicated, but I'll just run you through it to show that people's decisions are made before they make them, before they're conscious of having made them. And you can actually predict to a large extent what those decisions are by doing functional magnetic resonance imaging. So what you do is you have somebody strapped into an fMRI machine, and you show them a series of slides on these pictures. And each slide has 4 numbers in the corners, and then a number in the middle, and a letter in the middle, and those 2 are the ones you have to pay attention to. These slides go by at a rate of 1 per second. So somebody's just sitting there chugging along, and they've trained these people, and they tell them, okay, at some point you're going to decide whether you're going to perform an act of addition or subtraction on the next 2 slides you see. So you have a decision to make, add or subtract. It turns out that people do each one about half the time. So here's the slides going by, and at this point, the person decides he's going to do an act, or she is going to do an act of subtraction. When you make that decision, you record in your mind the letter on the slide at the time that you made that decision. In this case, it's Z. Okay, so now you know you're going to subtract the next 2 numbers in the middle that come by, 1 per second. So the first one is 6. Sorry, can't read that. Is it? Yeah, and 2. And so you do the subtraction in your mind, and it's 4. And the next slide, one of the correct answers is in the corner. And now you press a button corresponding to the correct answer, which will tell the experimenter what decision you actually made, because this is a decision of subtraction. So here you press a button, and then in the next slide that goes by, 1 second later, you put down the letter that was on the screen when you made the decision to add or subtract. Okay? So you made this decision back here, 4 seconds before, to add or subtract, and then you record that moment where you made the decision. Now your brain's wired up, so you can actually test, well, what's going on in the brain up to and after that person made the decision. And it turns out, the point at which the decision is made is 0 seconds on this graph. It's the vertical red line. Brain recording shows the percentage of, scanning various parts of the brain, shows the percentage of correct answers you can predict before that decision is made based on because the blood flow to the brain differs on whether you decide to add or subtract. And you can see in these cases, in the pronucleus, I'm not an expert on brain chemistry, the posterior cingulate and the medial frontopolar, you can predict with 60% accuracy 6 seconds before that person is conscious of having made the decision that they were going to subtract rather than add. Now, it's not 100%, right? fMRI is not a really good way to measure what's going on in the brain, but this is a highly statistically significant result, which means that you can predict whether a person's going to add or subtract 6 seconds before they're conscious of having made that decision. So something was going on in their brain that had not yet bubbled up into consciousness. And experiment after experiment shows this kind of result. Sometimes, depending on the experiment, you can predict up to 7 to 10 seconds before somebody is conscious of having made a decision what the decision will be. Or if you want greater accuracy, 1 second before they're conscious of having made a decision, you can predict with up to 80% accuracy. I'm absolutely convinced that if we have better ways of scanning brains and measuring neurons, that we could predict stuff like this with nearly 100% accuracy. What this means, of course, is that your conscious will has no effect on what your decision was. It was made in your brain beforehand. It had not come to consciousness. Well, this just substantiates what we already know, that what's deterministically bubbling around in our brain is what conditions our behavior. Okay. So, if determinism is true, and I will maintain that it is, our sense of agency is an illusion. It's a very powerful one. It's so powerful that I could not even persuade Steven Weinberg, a Nobel laureate physicist who's also an atheist, that he did not have libertarian free will. He said, "Are you trying to tell me I couldn't have done something else?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Don't believe it." Okay. If Steven Weinberg can be seduced by the illusion of agency, then anybody can. So I don't hope to change people's minds instantly on this, but I hope with some cogitation about this and reflection on the nature of your brain and your physical substance that you might come around to this view. And as I'll say, there are very definite consequences of this view. Misconceptions about determinism. When I write about this on my website, I always get a lot of readers saying, this can't be right for reason X, Y, and Z. And they misunderstand what determinism entails. First of all, people think that determinism makes you apathetic or nihilistic. If you really think that everything you do is determined by the laws of physics, why bother to get out of bed in the morning? Everything's already been mapped out before you. Well, first of all, your sense of agency is too strong for that. Look at me, I'm a determinist and an incompatibilist, and I'm up here making a lot of effort to give a talk. Why did I get out of bed this morning? I hoped to persuade people, and that was determined by the laws of physics. E.O. Wilson has made this sentence: without belief in free will, the mind, imprisoned by fatalism, would slow and deteriorate. Okay, well, that's just not borne out by the evidence, because there's a lot of philosophers who are determinists and also incompatibilists who go about their daily lives perfectly fine. Belief in determinism makes you cheat and act badly. You're free from the moral constraints that normally bind other people that believe in free will. Dan Dennett is one of the exponents of this view, and he's going to hear this talk on YouTube, and he's going to rip my tuchus into hamburger. But I've got him by his own words here. This is his Erasmus lecture, in which he says if neuroscientists say we're already puppets controlled by the environment, they're making a big mistake. The idea that free will is an illusion is likely to have profoundly unfortunate social consequences if not rebutted forcefully. Well, I'm sorry, but free will is an illusion in the sense that I mentioned. The unfortunate social consequences I don't believe in. I'll talk about that in a minute. Dennett sees it as his brief to rebut these consequences forcefully. The way he does it is make up another definition of free will so that we can tell ourselves, yeah, we do have some kind of free will. And so we're not going to be thieves and rapists and killers and cheaters and things like that. Paul Davies, many of you may know him, he's a physicist who has definite sympathies for theism, has even said that even if we know that free will of the nature I said is a fiction, it's a fiction worth maintaining. If free will really is an illusion, let's keep it. Okay, now doesn't this remind you of something like religion or God? And as I'll try to show you, there's a lot of parallels between the people that keep trying to tell you you have free will, despite determinism, and theists like Paul Davies. Another misconception, determinism gives everybody an excuse to do anything, and nobody is culpable and be punished because we don't have a choice about what we do. Here's legal analyst Jeffrey Rosen. Since all behavior is caused by our brains, wouldn't this mean that all behavior could potentially be excused? No, that's not the way it is. You don't have a choice about what you do, but if you do something wrong, there are very good reasons why society should punish you. If you do something right, there are very good reasons why society should laud you, because we are susceptible to that kind of social opprobrium or disopprobrium. Determinism means that everything is predictable, but it doesn't seem like that in our lives, right? I mean, we seem to be buffeted by a series of psychological and environmental accidents. Aside from quantum indeterminacy, that's just the way it is. Everything is predictable, except that we don't have the kind of knowledge we need to predict what we're going to do 20 years from now. That would require knowing basically the position of every molecule and every person we're going to interact with, all the nature of the weather and all kinds of stuff, and we don't have that kind of information. So on a practical level, things are unpredictable. On a conceptual level, with the exception of quantum mechanics, which is fundamentally unpredictable, yeah, everything we do for the rest of our lives could be predicted if we had perfect knowledge. And all our decisions could be read out. Determinism means it's useless to try to change people's minds. This is the biggest misconception we have about free will. If we're determined, then what good is it to try to persuade people to change their minds? What good is it for me to stand up here and try to get you to accept my view of free will? Well, this is a misconception because part of what builds your brain is what comes in from the environment. The example I like to use is you have a nice friendly dog that you're given, and then every time it comes up to you, you kick it, right? What's going to happen? The dog is going to learn through rewiring of its neurons that you are a person to be avoided. And it's the same with other human beings. We're susceptible to the influences of other people. Punishment, reward, love, etc. That does not mean that we're not determined. What it means is that part of the influences that physically impinge on our neurons and make us behave is our environment. Okay, and so yes, it is useful to try to change people's minds. Now, even our very desire to change people's minds, the fact that I'm up here trying to do this is determined by my own, physical constitution and environment. That is the infinite regress and this sort of annoying thing about determinism. It's turtles all the way down. Okay. And here's, is there any point in trying to, this is a comment on my website, is there any point in trying to improve society when things have simply fated to happen? And how can you deter people through punishing others if there's no free will? Well, this is, again, a fundamental misconception of what determinism says. You can change people's minds, and you can change other people's minds by what you do to other people. If you know that if you run a stop sign, you're going to be executed, you better believe that people would stop running stop signs. Okay, now we get to the doctrine of compatibilism, which is the view that although your behaviors really are determined by your genes and environments, because compatibilists are determinists, like the rest of us naturalists, and at the time, and they'll admit, including my friend Dan Dennett, that you could not have chosen otherwise than what you did at any given moment, you still have a form of free will. Okay. And then there are various varieties of compatibilism, which are incompatible with each other. And I'll give you some examples of how they managed to rescue the concept of free will. I don't find any of these attempts to rescue it very convincing. First of all, you have free will if you don't make your decision under completely coercive circumstances. In other words, if someone puts a gun to your head and says, give me your wallet, you're not acting under free will. But if you give somebody your wallet and you don't have a gun to your head, then you're acting under free will. Okay, so that's the definition of free will, that you're coerced. The problem that people don't realize when they adumbrate this version of free will is that your brain is exactly as coercive as if somebody with a gun, because it tells you exactly what you're going to do. And remember, when you have a gun to your head and say your money or your life, you have a choice, right? You can either die or you can give them your money. Remember the old Jack Benny skit when they said your money or your life, and he just sat there cogitating for a while, and the bandit said, well, hurry up. And he said, well, I'm thinking. He was a notorious cheapskate, of course. I believe Sam Harris said this: there isn't anything materially more coercive about giving money at gunpoint than drinking milk when you're thirsty. And if you think about it, he's absolutely right. Your brain is making you drink milk when you're thirsty, and you don't have a choice about that. You don't have any more choice about that than you do about giving your wallet to a thief that's holding a gun to your head. That's compatibilism version 1. Version 2, this is Dan Dennett's version of what free will is. Yeah, we're all determined, but the human brain is very complicated, and we take in all these inputs before we cogitate, which is his word for run the computer program in our neurons that's deterministic, to come out with an output, which is your decision. So we're basically very complicated animals, much more complicated than something like a planarium, and that fact that all these things have to be weighed by neurological programs constitutes free will. I don't understand, what's free about this, or why it's any different from what a crow does, or a squirrel, or any other animal that's able to weigh factors. The fact is that a brain is a complicated computer. I mean, that's a simplification, but it has evolved to run programs and weigh various factors, even without our knowing about it. So I don't consider this, what's free about this? It's no more free. It just means that our computer program is more complicated than that of a paramecium. A chess-playing computer does exactly this. You put in the moves, it considers all the possible ramifications of what could happen, like you do when you're worried about your future behavior, and then it makes a move. Okay, does a chess-playing computer have free will? Most people would say no. Where's the freedom? The output is still deterministic. It's absolutely predictable. Okay, here's compatibilism 3. Free will is the view that if circumstances had been slightly different, you could have made a different decision and acted on it. I don't really understand this one at all because everybody agrees with this, including libertarians. If things weren't the same, you're not going to act the same. So what does that mean by, free will? Free will has to do with being in identical circumstances and then seeing if you could have decided differently from what you did. And another view of compatibilism, which is also very common and exposed by Dan Dennett, is free will represents the decisions people make when they are not mentally ill. That is, if you were one of those nice people who is persuaded by moral suasion, if people tell you you shouldn't steal, you believe them, and then you don't steal, then that's free will. Whereas the miscreants, the pathological people who don't or aren't persuaded by that way, they don't have free will. I find this unconvincing as well because even whether you're persuaded by moral suasion or not is determined. Whether you're the kind of person who accepts other people's notions of morality is something that you have no control over. Moreover, and if you don't, that's something you don't have any control over either. So what's free about this? There's nothing free, and that's the word you got to keep concentrating on. When you say that this is a form of free will, what really is the freedom here? Sam Harris, okay, anyway, I'll get on to Sam in a minute. But what I'm trying to say is, first of all, the debate between compatibilists, the fact that we have some other kind of free will, and incompatibilists like myself that say that the real important version of free will is the libertarian one, is a semantic argument. It's an argument about what free will means. We're all in agreement that we're determinists, that we're naturalists, that there is no ghost in the machine, that at any moment, except for quantum indeterminacy, we can only do what we are programmed to do by our environment and our genes. So we're all in agreement on scientific facts. What we're in disagreement with is what we call free will, and it's a semantic argument. Why is it important to deal with this semantic argument? Is because the traditional and ubiquitous notion of free will is the libertarian one, not these compatibilist ones. If you went to somebody on the street or to a religionist and said, is your notion of free will that you're a complex organism and even though you can only give one output, your inputs are complicated, they'd say, hell no. It's that I could have chosen Jesus Christ as my Savior or not. Sam Harris, I think, he's very eloquent, much more eloquent than I, has said the real problem is people feel that they are the authors of their thoughts and actions. And this is the reason why there is a problem of free will worth talking about. We feel we are free, and so that's the notion of free will that we need to deal with, because it's the notion that is refuted by the scientific facts. Sam also dismissed compatibilism, I love this statement, as he characterizes it as a puppet is free as long as he loves his strings. Okay, in other words, we're not free to move anywhere we want, but we just have to say that those strings constitute some kind of free will for us. Okay. Why do people even espouse compatibilism? Why isn't it more important to recognize that our behaviors are determined by the laws of physics than to play these semantic word games with philosophies that are, and to use the Yiddish pilpul, useless lucubrations about trivial things? Why do they do this? It's because most people feel, and Dennett has certainly made this very clear, as well as others. I don't mean to beat on Dan, although he has beaten on me many times, so I'm exercising which I shouldn't with free will, which is retribution. We certainly don't want people disabling themselves with bad science. So I think this is a very serious issue. In other words, we don't want people to know that their behaviors are all determined because they're going to go wild on the streets. And many, many people have said this. This is very similar to religion. We don't want people to know there's no God. I call it the little people argument. We know better because we're smart and we're scientific and stuff, but you got to let the people have their religion, because if they don't believe in God, they're going to become immoral. Same thing with free will. If you don't think you have free will of a sort, then God knows what is going to happen to the fabric of society. This, I believe, although the compatibilists will deny it, is the root cause for philosophers trying to tell us that we have other kinds of free will. And in fact, this is a quote from Dan which says it explicitly. This reminds me of the anecdote, I think Richard has probably told this, about the wife of the Bishop of Worcester back in the 19th century when she was told that Mr. Darwin had shown that evolution was true and that humans were descended from apes. And this is maybe apocryphal, but the Bishop of Worcester's wife is supposed to say, "My dear, descended from the apes, let us hope it is not true. But if it is, let us pray it will not become generally known." This is what I think people think about determinism and free will, what the compatibilists do. Yeah, we're all determined, but let's sweep that under the rug, okay? Because here's a shiny new version of free will that you really have, and let's just forget about this nasty determinism. The problem is that determinism has very serious consequences for our view of how we punish and reward people, and I'll get to that very shortly. Now, some more retributive bashing of compatibilists, because I think it really is an unproductive, useless detour in philosophy and psychology to try to confect some version of free will that is not really free but makes us feel good about ourselves. It resembles theology in many ways. First of all, theologians and compatibilists redefine notions that have been long held. Sophisticated theologians tell us God isn't really what we thought. It's not an old man in the sky that listens to your prayers. It's a ground of being. Or, it's everything. I mean, the definitions go on forever. Same thing with free will. It's not the libertarian version that everybody believed in or religious believe in. It's something new, and here's the one I'm going to offer you. In both areas, I believe definitions are concocted post facto to comport with an emotional commitment or a belief about social consequences. So, deists, sophisticated ones like David Bentley Hart will say, well, God is not what you think. He's something else, and here's the definition that I've come up with that comports with what your emotional commitment. Same thing with compatibilism. People think, well, we still got to have free will. This is my take on it, okay? And philosophers are really going to get mad at this, but I'm going to do some psychologizing. They think we still have to have free will because it's important for the social fabric. So therefore, let me think of a definition of free will that cannot be refuted scientifically. Same thing with God. In both cases, it's dangerous for the public to know the truth. As Paul Davies said, if we knew that free will wasn't true, there'd be bad things that happen. So we got to let them maintain this fiction, the little people argument. That also goes for God. Some of the most sophisticated theologians who barely believe in God will still claim that we should not tell people that, even about my notion of God or that there is no God, because they're going to go wild. Both theologians and compatibilists cite humans as special. Many compatibilists say it's only Homo sapiens that has free will. No other animal does. It's hard to make that argument, but they do that. It's the same thing with theologians. Only humans are made in God's image, and only humans are capable of apprehending and worshiping God. There are as many versions of compatibilism as there are conceptions of God. And finally, both cases, both theologians and philosophers who are compatibilists dismiss science in favor of philosophy. They privilege philosophy and say that the notion of our behavior and being determined or not is not something that scientists should mess with. Here's another statement by Dan. Are we free? Neuroscience gives the wrong answer. It's as if we have nothing to say about human behavior. It's up to the philosophers to tell us whether we have free will or not. I profoundly disagree with that. Okay, so my view is, let's forget about these semantic arguments. Let's emphasize let's emphasize the determinism that's behind all our actions. Why is that good to do that? Let's forget about all the semantics. Let's forget about, sweeping determinism under the rug. Determinism should be flown like a banner because it is true. That's the one thing that we need to know. I doubt that there's anybody in this room that would claim that there is anything more to human behavior than the motions of the molecules that constitute our bodies, because most of us are naturalists. Second of all, if you believe in determinism or naturalism, it gets rid of this kind of invidious, infectious free will that theists believe in. You don't have a choice whether you believe to accept Jesus as a savior. There's no free will that excuses immoral actions of humans because God vouchsafed us this. And you can't blame gays for making a choice because they have no choice to make. I mean, if you talk to gay people, almost all of them will tell you, I didn't make a choice. I've always felt this way, which comports precisely with the fact that it is determined. And finally, and what I'll finish with, is determinism has serious implications for the criminal justice system, as well as for our notions of moral responsibility and personal behavior. And I think that the implications are good ones. That is, I don't think that we're going to lay in bed all day or go wild in the streets if we accept this notion of naturalism, because our feeling of agency is so strong, we cannot overcome it. We can accept determinism on an intellectual level, and just by doing that, we can wreak useful results in both our personal lives and for society at large. Personal advantages of determinism, and I realized this about a month ago when I was thinking about one of my old girlfriends, and she was the one that got away. It would have been nice if it had worked out. We'd be married, blah blah blah. And then I realized, well, there's no way it couldn't have worked out. It could have worked out because the laws of physics determined that. So why am I beating myself up about this when it could not have happened otherwise? Now, granted, it's hard to realize that, right? It's hard to avoid this self-recrimination. But if you really internalize that, you can realize that it takes away a certain amount of guilt feelings from you. You don't have to beat yourself up over, I should have done this instead of that. And it would have been different, because you could not have done this instead of that. I mean, you can feel sorry about what happened, or you can feel, upset like I did about the one that got away, but at least it eliminates a certain amount of, personal recrimination and self-beating up. It enables you to forgive yourself a little bit more. The most important implications for this are its effect on crime and punishment. Because once we realize that criminals do not have a choice about their act, or that somebody that does something good does not have a choice about their act. I mean, I like Bill Gates, he does good stuff, but Bill Gates didn't make a choice about whether he gave $50 million to help bring fresh water to Africa. That was in his genes and his environment. That's not to say that he shouldn't be praised for that, of course, because when you praise somebody, they tend to do more, they like that, and they tend to do more of the good stuff. That's deterministic, by the way. That's one of the fallacies that we overcome. So, crime and punishment, and the criminal justice system already recognizes that there is a kind of criminality which should be excused, that based on whether you were in sound mind when you did the crime, or whether you're insane. So people already recognize that there is a degree of exculpability for criminals when they do something, but not always. Here's Cecil Clayton, who was executed recently in Missouri. If ever there was a case for not killing somebody for committing a crime, it's Cecil Clayton, who had a sawmill, I think it was a sawmill accident. He lost 1/5 of his temporal lobe. You can see the scan of his brain, there's that big hole. And when this happened, he became socially irresponsible. He became somewhat of a sociopath, and he committed a murder. Okay. Normally, you'd say, well, he had no choice about this because his brain made him do otherwise. Now, when you think about that, remember, this is true of every criminal, not just Cecil Clayton. They executed him. Why did they execute him? Even though they recognized that he was formally mentally retarded and that he was a sociopath, they said he understood why he did wrong. People told him, you did wrong, and he said, yeah, I guess I did. So they killed him for that. Okay, that is the exculpatory circumstances. But we have to realize that every criminal no criminal has a choice about what they do when they do the crime. It is the result of their genes and their environment. Now, this does not mean that we shouldn't punish people for doing bad things, even under the rule of determinism. First of all, we need to keep people that do bad things out of society, either by putting them in jails or hospitals, because people that do bad things tend to do bad things again. So we need to get them out of society before they do further harm. So this is okay under determinism. Another thing is deterrence. Deterrence is a very real thing. We know it works, except in the case of capital punishment. And so by punishing people, you're setting a lesson for other people, which will affect their brains deterministically, saying, I better not do this because this could happen to me. If there's anything built into us by natural selection, it's the instinct for self-preservation, which is a proxy for reproduction. So yeah, deterrence is okay to punish. And you can punish people for rehabilitation purposes. If you consider it punishment. This is ultimately what we really should do if we could treat criminals properly, is to treat them so that they wouldn't go ahead and do what they do again. Now, the advantage of all this is that each of these can be scientifically tested, in principle. We could say, how much jail time is really good to deter other people? How do you rehabilitate people? All these are subject to experiments and tests. Granted, they're hard to do. We don't have a lot of money. But at least punishing people on these three bases is something that is warranted by determinism and is justified by the belief that criminals had no choice in what they did. You still have to put them away for various reasons. What is not justified by determinism is punishment based on retribution. Because retribution, killing somebody for what they did, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, implicitly assumes that people had a choice about what they did. That's why you have retributive punishment. You're paying them back for making the wrong choice. One of the retributions is capital punishment. It is not justifiable under a deterministic view, unless it acted as a deterrent, and it doesn't. So, killing somebody for retribution is not justifiable. And there's something else which was pointed out by the philosopher Greg Caruso at Stony Brook, that the view of determinism gets rid of this invidious Republican-spurred view called the just world belief, which is that people deserve what they get. If you're poor, you deserve it. We're not going to help you up with your bootstraps because, you made the choice to be poor, The just world belief is that people rise or fall to the level of society because they've made choices that are either good or bad. We know that that is not true, so once you accept determinism, then you know that you have to have more empathy for people because they are purely molecular products of their background. Somebody that's poor is not poor by choice, they're poor by their environment and their genes. So I'll finish off with two modest proposals about free will, and then just a few things about experiments that could be done to help answer this question. First of all, get rid of the notion of free will. Okay? If you're a naturalist, say, my decision was caused by internal forces that I did not understand. Okay? Sometimes you can't understand them, right? Like if you're a dog and you decide to avoid being kicked, the dog can't understand that, but we could if we were the ones being kicked. Second of all, get rid of the notion of moral responsibility, because that comes along with the baggage of being able to have chosen to behave morally or immorally. Call people responsible, if you will. Do not call them morally responsible, unless you're very careful about what you mean by moral responsibility. And I'll finish with very interesting questions that remain. These questions fall in the realm of both philosophy, because there is a role for philosophy in this endeavor. It's just that they don't have the hegemony over the whole field. First of all, what are the effects of a deterministic view on punishment or reward? How should we take on board the view that criminals cannot choose to behave good or ill in terms of our philosophy of how we reward and punish people? Second of all, what about this moral responsibility thing? What does it mean? If it means something beyond you had a choice about to behave good or ill, what is the notion of that moral responsibility? And then the scientific questions, how far ahead can we predict decisions before they're made consciously? This will involve brain scanning, maybe of individual neurons, and of course the last question, the greater understanding of the environmental and genetic factors that impinge on our behavior. And I'm absolutely sure that in the coming decades we'll be able to predict what people do a lot longer and with more accuracy than we did before. And since I'm an evolutionary biologist, the last question I want to bring up is this. We have this feeling of agency. When you go to lunch and you decide what you're going to pick out of those silver trays, there's nothing stronger than you're feeling like, I'm going to pass on these Thai noodles because I want the chicken, or, I should have a salad. But that's not true. And whether or not you guys are going to have a salad at lunch has already been determined before you get up and walk out of the store. You don't know it, but it's down there in your brain. So now it could be influence on your way to the lunch buffet. Like somebody could say, hey, Joe, look at that great salad over there. That's determinism, okay? And that could affect your choice. But by the time you get to that salad bowl, whether or not you take it is already in your brain. You just don't know it yet. Why do we have this feeling of agency? Is it Larry Moran? Larry, you're here? Yeah, there he is. He's a friend of mine. He would call it an epiphenomenon because he doesn't really believe in that natural selection is powerful. And he has some good things to say about that. Is as powerful as we think it is. But I think there's a case to be made, at least, that our feeling that we can make choices is a result of natural selection. And I'll just throw out at the end 3 theories on why natural selection could have given us this illusory feeling that we could make choices. The first of all is that it could have been a result of selection in our brain to live harmoniously with others. If we feel that we are agents and can make choices, then we can also feel that other people are agents and can make choices, and that nexus could enable people to live more harmoniously in small groups. These are all purely speculative. I don't even know how to test them. Second of all, it tells our brains whether we're doing something to ourselves or whether somebody else is doing it to others. So if all of a sudden you feel your hand shaking like that, you want to know whether somebody has your hand and is shaking it or whether you've got palsy or a twitch or something. I mean, that is drastically important for your survival, to know if something that is some feeling you have isn't being done by somebody else or is actually originating with you. And so maybe the feeling of agency evolved to promote this. And then my favorite theory is this: you try harder to achieve things if you have agency, because those people who tried harder to achieve things left more offspring. And if the feeling of agency promoted that, because we think, wow, you know, if I do that, I'm making a choice here and blah, 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 then the natural selection could build into us the feeling that we really are the harbingers of our fate. And I don't know the answer to these questions. I doubt that we ever will. I don't even know if we'll know that agency is a result of natural selection, unless we somehow find agency genes and are able to sequence them and look for the natural selection. And I'll finish with a quote from Albert Einstein, since he was the smartest man in the world. Whatever he says has got to be correct. At least this is what religious people believe. They're always quoting Einstein saying, you know, he believed in God, and since he was the smartest man in the world, there must be a God. Well, here's Einstein's belief in free will. If the moon, in the act of completing its eternal way around the earth, were gifted with self-consciousness, it would be fully convinced that it was traveling its way in its own accord. So would a being endowed with higher insight and more perfect intelligence, that doesn't mean he believed in that being, watching man and his doing smile about man's illusion that he was acting according to his own free will. Thank you.